Hey everyone, welcome to another live feed. This is after reviewing Hakchi 2.3, doing several live streams on it, getting multi-boot working, then going back to Hakchi CE. Now, I want to stress that everybody that's been involved in this in the production of these excellent tools that we use has done an excellent job. They've really been fantastic, but it comes down to people like me who are completely independent. I haven't written a line of code, not in my life. I write lines of code quite frequently, but not written a single line of code for Hakchi 2.30 or for Hakchi CE. I've just been testing, I've just been reviewing, having a look, configuring. So here are my thoughts. And we're going to start with what we've done earlier today. So I'll just zoom in here. So this is the Hakchi folder that I now have on my USB drive. So I'm obviously talking about the USB hosts here for the Super Nintendo Classic. If we go into the games folder, immediately we can see NES Japan, NES USA. We have an SNES Europe and an SNES Japan. Basically, I'm running 4 different firmwares from my USB drive on my Super Nintendo Classic. This is all thanks to, well, just Hakchi in general. Whoever implemented this, fantastic, great stuff. It works in both Hakchi 2.3 and it works in both Hakchi CE. So if you want a multi-boot, you can do in both. If you want to, and I'm just going to have a quick look here. If you want to take a look now, we're going to look directly at Hakchi CE because this is what I would advise that anybody who wants a full... It's difficult to say this because obviously Cluster M's doing a great job and he's making some progress on Hakchi 2.3. But for those of you out there who want a fully usable version of Hakchi to customize your Super Nintendo Classic, I can only advise you use Hakchi CE because Hakchi CE, I've discovered after prolonged use, does a lot more than I initially thought it did. For starters, once you've selected a console type, and yes, you can select all 4 console types and copy games to all 4 firmwares, that's easy enough. But it does separate them out into the original games and then individual systems. And when you go to export, you can create linked export games, which is much quicker than Hakchi 2.3. Also, the way that you can do this, you could just basically tick everything, export it all, and then in the root with everything there, ask it to split by app type, and then it splits by your different console types, which is great. In a mere maybe 30 minutes, I've put all of this together, and this is the layout for my basic, if you like, the root of my Super Nintendo, which I'll show you shortly. Also, if you look into the console type for NES, you'll see that once it loads the games, of course, you'll see I've got my NES games in there and my full Nintendo NES collection in there as well. Click on export, you'll see what I mean. You'll see I've got my shortcuts to my different firmwares. That is in each and every firmware. I have my shortcuts to swap. So, I don't have to go back to one interface. I can basically switch from any interface to another firmware. In here, I've got the basic games that came with the NES firmware, plus I've got a full NES collection listed alphabetically there. Excellent stuff. Same goes for the Super Famicom and the Famicom computer. So let's get on with this then. Let me close this down and very quickly eject this drive and put it in my Super Nintendo. I'm using the Super Nintendo Classic in the European region. I'm using an on-the-go adapter, which I'll quickly just show you that one. It's like an L-shaped on-the-go adapter, which I've reinforced. If you've seen previous videos, it just keeps it in place. I'm going for one of the octopus-style ones. I'm going to switch this on and show you. It has a boot screen as well. That's another advantage for using Hakchi CE. So if you want to use boot screens, please consider Hakchi CE at this time. I do know that Cluster M will continue his work, but no idea whether or not it will be directly on Hakchi CE or merge. So that's the original. I've put a boot screen on there, so hopefully, there we go, it changes. And this is the stock firmware, if you like. This is the European firmware that's made for my console. So if we look through it, we can see that I've got several icons to switch to a different firmware, including this one. The reason why, and I guess it says classic or whatever, spelt incorrectly, but the reason those are there is so that I can switch on other firmwares. I just copy these 4 to each firmware. And then, of course, I've got all the individual RetroArch cores running, which I've copied over, which work fine. Super Nintendo games, this is where I keep my collection of Super Nintendo games and all non-NES games. So only the NES games are in the NES side of things. So quickly boot here. There we go. Super Nintendo games working fine. And all RetroArch cores from KMFD Manic can be loaded as well. Okay, so let's talk about this multi-boot now. This is Hakchi CE that I'm running with, and I'm going to boot the Famicom Classic. So we're going to be looking now at the Japanese NES. So the machine's rebooted. Yep, I have a dog. The machine's rebooted, hence you're seeing that boot screen. And once it reboots into the Japanese Famicom firmware. So you can go in there and you can play those games. I will play one. Let me have a look there. Pac-Man's there. I saw this one earlier, which... what's this one? No idea what this one is. But clearly the important thing is... Oh, yes, I do know what this one is. This looks very, very familiar. Is it Ghost and Goblins? It could be that one. Also, unique games, I think, that I found earlier. Which one was it? Come on now. Where is it? It's around here somewhere. The artwork's really nice for these Japanese games. Very different from the Western style that we would have had. So, I think this was one that I played earlier that was unique to Japan. So there we go. That's running on a Super Nintendo European version. A Japanese ROM. Okay, dead. So obviously from the Japanese ROM menu, you can save. There we go. Just put that one down there. And we can switch. And we don't have to switch back to the standard firmware that came with my console. We'll switch immediately now to the Super Famicom Classic firmware. So again, the machine powers off, the LED disappears and reappears, and then we'll get the boot screen once more. So again, this is just saying that if you have to choose between Hakchi CE and Hakchi 2.3, I've already used 2.3 over the last few days, and I can say that it's getting better, but it's still obviously got a lot of catching up to do in terms of time as well as effort, because CE has really been worked on now for quite a few months. So if you go through the games here, you'll see games like Super Formation Soccer, which is a Japan-only game, I guess. So that's working absolutely fine on the European Super Nintendo. So I'm just going to now switch to the final firmware, which is the NES Classic. You'll notice in the Japanese firmwares, I've not put any additional ROMs in there. It's just the stock and the firmware icons to switch. So I'm switching back now. I'm going to go to the NES Classic firmware. European and US, I think, was more or less the same thing. I'll just pan down a little bit. There we go. So yeah, first time I've loaded this, so it asked me to choose a language, and as you can see, we've got the NES Western firmware Classic there. So all the games are there. Let's just load one of them up. Put Kirby on. And as you can see, again, that's fine. So basically what I've got here now is what I would definitely say is, of all the different setups I've had, this is the best setup I've had on my Super Nintendo Classic. It uses USB host. I can fit... well, people have asked me how large a memory stick I've used. I've used up to 64 gigabytes, but that was an SD card that was fairly slow, so I've decided to go for a 32 gigabyte USB 3 stick, which means that the transfer and everything is a lot quicker and more reliable. So inside the alphabetized list, you can see I've got a load of NES games, including Barbie. And of course, this isn't using RetroArch, this is using the NES emulator, as it's in the NES firmware. I didn't want to change it, I thought give Nintendo's a go. Just one moment, I've got a visitor coming in now. I'll start my restreaming of this live stream in a couple of minutes. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.